Trails and Ghost Towns with Mike Roberts and Bill Barlee.
Well, welcome to Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. I'm Mike Roberts with Bill Barlee, our resident expert, placer miner, author, historian, former school teacher. Is there anything you haven't done in the annals of follow the history of British Columbia, Bill?
Well, it's always intrigued me, Mike, ever since I was a kid in Rossland. It's been kind of a consuming passion.
You have some treasure to talk about today. That's the subject of today's program.
A lot of treasures in the southern interior, lost mines and so on. One specific one today.
One specific. Where are we looking today? What country?
We're looking at the Lardo. And the Lardo, most people who are watching the program probably don't know where the Lardo is. And it's still not well known. But in the 1890s, it wasn't well known at all. There were no maps of the area. It was simply kind of an undefined region of the interior. Now, it lies north of Kootenai Lake and east of the Arrow Lakes. So it's in that part of the country. You can still travel through the Lardo today, Mike, and travel 20 or 30 miles and still not meet a vehicle.
Sounds like interesting country.
Fascinating country.
All right, we're going to take a look at a treasure story out of the Lardo country. We'll be back in just a second to identify some of the places, some of the names, and treasure. Don't go away. Ghost Towns with Bill Barlee, our resident expert. The country here, the Lardo country, when did they discover what was happening there?
Well, Mike, with the discovery of the silver finds on Toad Mountain, which was really the Silver King mine, then Rossland itself, and then the boundary country, focus of attention began to shift into all parts of the Kootenai country, and especially into those more inaccessible parts. And one of those inaccessible parts was the Lardo. So that by the late 1890s, a band of American prospectors, 8 American prospectors, came down the Arrow Lakes from Revelstoke and branched off into Kootenai Arm, and then went overland. And they contacted or made contact with the Lardo River, and they began panning gold in the Lardo, and realized that there was some gold there. And although they went back with reports that were kind of varying and a little bit discouraging, other miners said, hey, if there's gold in the Lardo River, there must be mineralization in the mines and in the hills nearby. So they began to flood into the area, both from the Caslow side and from the Revelstoke side, and they began to discover, indeed, there were magnificent mines in 2 belts in that region. One was called Silver Cup Ridge, and the other was the famous Lime Belt of the Lardo. And Silver Cup Ridge produced mines like the Nettie L, which is an extension of Silver Cup Ridge, the Silver Cup mine itself, the Triune, the Winslow, the Okanagan, the Foggy Day, and a whole bunch of mines in that particular area. And these were primarily silver mines, although a few of them, such as the Nettie L, were very good gold properties.
Primarily Americans who were doing the discovery here?
Most of the first miners in the Lardo were Americans. Now, there were some exceptions. There were some Canadians, but we were very close to the American line, and the states had produced a lot of very good hard rock mining prospectors, and so they naturally drifted over the line.
And they assumed this was going to be hard rock because they didn't figure that the gold they found in the creeks was the kind of placer gold. They figured there would be a lot of hard rock mining to get in here.
Well, sure, because the placer gold comes from hard rock stringers invariably. It comes from a local origin. They knew this.
Yeah.
And so they established one town, first of all, and this, of course, was a town called Ferguson.
Okay. How many people were in Ferguson?
Well, at its height, probably about 1,000. About half a dozen hotels, founded by a guy called David Ferguson, who, with tongue-in-cheek, first called it St. David's, and later became Ferguson after him. And it was really in the center of the Lardo, and it was one of the 3 towns upon which the fortunes of the Lardo swung. Ferguson was the major and the oldest town and the biggest town.
Okay. This place looks like it was hell to mine.
Well, it was very difficult to get into, first of all. This is Camborne, and this is up the Incomaplex River, and the Incomaplex River is one of the most dangerous rivers in the entire West, because you can't ford the Incomaplex. It rises out of the Battle Mountains and the bad shots, and you have that glacier-fed water coming down. It's swift, it's deep, you can't see into it, and so it's very difficult. And they established a number of mines around this area, and this was primarily a gold mining community. And you can see the tramline routes coming down the mountains from the mines above, and they're bringing down the ore into the crushing mills below.
Very big town?
About 500 people.
So a close-knit body of people making the wealth out of that operation.
Yes, very, very fascinating area, very moody area even today, Mike. Very little left in Camborne.
And Gerard, where's Gerard?
Well, Gerard is at the foot of Trout Lake, and at the head of Trout Lake is Trout Lake City. But Gerard is at the foot, and it was quite important because it was one of the terminuses of the Arrow Lake and Kootenai Railway. And so that they sent a railway through to tap the mineral resources of mainly of Silver Cup Ridge. And so Gerard was ideally situated.
Now, in talking about these places, we're not talking about large population centers, not large in the way that Sandon was, not large in the way Rossland was. Smaller communities. What accounts for that? Just a lack of wealth, or?
Partly because the mines weren't as deep and as long-standing or quite as rich as the mines in Rossland or in Nelson, for instance, but also because of the area itself. Inaccessible, difficult to get in, very, very difficult winters, lots of snow, hard to ford across the river, so they had to have ways to get in. One of the ways to get in was to build a railroad, and this was the Arrow Lake and Kootenai.
Okay, that gets us to the railroad. This is Poplar.
This is the third town. This is the third town of the Lardo Country, and it was late, 1903. A group of miners decided to prospect for once on the west side of the Lardo River. Prior to that time, most of the prospecting had been done on the east side of the Lardo. That is on the Silver Cup Ridge, and beyond that, the Lime Dyke and so on. But now they began to shift because they were running out of room to prospect. And amazingly enough, within several hundred yards of this railway that we see in this picture, they discovered a mine called the Lucky Jack. And the Lucky Jack, of course, was magnificent. It was, the gold there, they say, was large enough to hang your hat on.
That'd attract attention. These two guys that we see here are not members of the Lucky Jack mine. These are just two other prospectors, but this picture shows something about the nature of the mine and how they worked it. What do you learn about that from looking at this shot?
Well, first of all, this is the old Marquis and Gilbert claim, and it was very rich, and it was peculiar because a lot of the ore out of this area, that was the Marquis and Gilbert, the Lucky Jack, the Bullock, and the Swede group, for instance, had kind of a rusty red oxidized quartz. And through this oxidized quartz, free gold ran. And it was extremely rich quartz. And in this particular shot, you see where they've got a shaft and they brought up their ore in kind of a homemade box on a winch.
That basket was their ore car. In this
sure
case.
It was.
Didn't need to bring up a lot. And how deep would that mine have been? Baby?
Probably only about 15 feet at that time.
Are those rocks that you see to the right bottom of the screen, is that the ore that came up in the basket?
This is discarded stuff that they felt was not rich enough really to work down into, or send out.
So these guys would work that claim themselves?
Yes, they would.
And what, would they work an 8-hour day? Would they sleep there? Would they guard it? What was it?
Well, they guarded the Lucky Jack, you see. They actually hired a crew to guard it because the gold was so rich in the Lucky Jack that they had to protect their interests.
This looks like the finest bunch of prospectors you've ever seen. These are guys who work that country.
Yes, this is a group of individuals in front of the old Grand Hotel. Grand Hotel was one of the 6 hotels in Poplar at its height, and it was the longest-lasting hotel. And the owner was a guy called H.G. Johnson. He's visible on the left-hand side of this photograph. And he was very keen on the area.
The guy with the beard, or the guy standing just behind him?
The guy who's sitting on the rail.
Next to the guy with the Stetson hat.
That's right. And at the extreme right is his old sister, Helen Johnson.
And just in behind her, there's a sign on the wall of the Grand Hotel.
And this has something to do with the story. This sign is the sign for the C.P. telegraph.
The Grand Hotel, therefore, I guess, was near the C.P. telegraph line. I mean, the line followed the rails.
Sure it was.
And there's the Grand Hotel, capable of holding how many people in its heyday?
Probably about 40 or 45.
Big place.
Yeah, it was pretty big.
And that brings us to our man on the velocipede.
And this is Walter Clough, very interesting man, one of many in this particular country. Came out of Slocan City, was a lineman for the C.P.R. for about 40 years and traveled all through that country, making sure the lines were all right. And so he traveled up through Whitewater and up through Nashton and down into Caslow and up through Gerard and up through Poplar Creek and so on.
Pumping that car the whole time?
Pumping that car the whole time.
Now, this is where we get to the story. Listening to you talk, it's like reading an Agatha Christie novel. If you forget anything that you say, something about the ore is important about this story, the Lost Mortar and Pestle Mine.
Very important, because there are all types of ore, but the ore that the miners found most attractive was what they call free milling. So in other words, this would probably be quartz ore that would have stringers of gold coming right through it, which would be visible gold. So they could take this ore and actually pulverize it in a mortar and pestle of varying sizes, which is, we have an example in front of us, and they could actually pulverize this ore, and after pulverizing the ore, they would break away the quartz, and it would leave virtually free gold.
Give us a demonstration.
They would go like this, and they would pulverize it. It'd take them 5 or 10 minutes. And then after they'd pulverize the ore, they'd take away the quartz, and they would bring out what would be free gold.
Now, this gold that you've got in your hand here is placer gold, but it nonetheless come like that. It may have some other ore attached to it in that stage.
And it would be a little sharper. It wouldn't be worn, but it would look like this, except it was sharper ore, a sharper edge, because it had just come out of the quartz. So they would really have what is called cash in hand, which is what they wanted.
Yeah. Now, when you'd, what would old H.G. Johnson, how was old H.G. Johnson associated with this?
Well, the interesting thing is that Walter Clough, when he went up that railway up towards Gerard, he would have to stay overnight. So he naturally stayed overnight at the Grand Hotel. And staying overnight with old Johnson, H.G. Johnson, and his sister Helen, he came to know them very well. And they began to trust him. And one day, in the early 1930s, he was sitting there talking with them, and the old man got up abruptly, without a word of explanation, picked up 2 pails, and walked out of the room. This was rather puzzling to Clough. So he waited, and then in a little while, the old man was back again, in a little over an hour. And he was carrying in the 2 pails, some extremely rich ore. It was quartz, but it was heavily oxidized, kind of a coppery color, and there was massive amounts of free gold running all through it. And Clough, who had been all through this mining country and knew it very well, had never seen ore like it. And the old man then proceeded to take his mortar and pestle out and pulverize the ore and showed Clough some of the results, and of course the results were astronomical. This was bonanza ore. And Clough, of course, was astonished, and the old man proceeded to explain that whenever he needed some money, and indeed his hotel didn't do much business, he simply made his way to a lost mine, or a lost prospect he had, and picked up some of the ore, brought it back, crushed it down, weighed it out at home with scales like this, then took it into the bank in Caslo, either the Bank of Montreal or the Bank of British North America, and they would give him so much on that, they would send it to the mint and give him the return when he came back. So he had his own bank, indeed. It was a bank, a gold bank.
I'm going to take a break here, because where would this man, H.G. Johnson, have been able to get access to this ore? Had to be close by. We'll talk about that when we come back after this break. Don't go away. Those towns, the Lost Mortar and Pestle Mine. So, okay, where was the Grand Hotel? Picture that.
Grand Hotel was right in the center of Poplar Creek. And, you know, there were several main streets in Poplar Creek, very close to the old railroad line, quite close to the Lardo River, on the west side of the river. So when Johnson left the Grand Hotel to his hidden mine...
To get his little takeout order of gold.
That's right, his prospect. He couldn't have traveled very far, because he was back within just over the hour, according to Clough and his recollections. And Clough, remember, did have some of the ore for many years. And his daughter, Mrs. Tracy Cooper, had that ore in Slocan City, and it was in a Carter's little liver bottle full of mostly gold with a little bit of this reddish quartz adhering to it. So it did come from the immediate area. Some people say it came from the Bullock, and some say it came from the Marquis and Gilbert, and some say it came from the Swede group, and some say it came from the Lucky Jack. I don't think it came from any of them. I think it came from another area within the immediate vicinity, probably within 1.5 miles, probably to the west of Poplar Creek, or the site of old Poplar Creek.
Okay. Have you gone and walked this country yourself?
Well, sure, along with lots of people.
And what have you found? I mean, you had to go out a half an hour, acting like an old hotelier with a couple of heavy pails. What are we talking about distance?
Well, we're talking probably not more than 1.5 miles, probably within, we'll say 1.5 miles, maximum of 1.5 miles from Poplar Creek. on the west side of the river. He
Yep.
did not cross the river, evidently.
Okay.
So it's on the west side, so that's been narrowed down. You've got, half of it's cut away.
Any chance that old Johnson was just a claim jumper and maybe had an agreement with a guy who was running a tab at the hotel that if he needed a couple of buckets of ore, he could go get it? Sort of a parlor trick. Do you have any observation about that?
Well, I don't, but old Clough did. Clough trusted what old H.G. Johnson told him.
Yeah.
And there was no reason for Johnson to lie. If he'd had an agreement, he would have said he had an agreement. Evidently, he didn't have an agreement. He had a spot where he'd discovered a quartz stringer running through, and it was shot through with free gold. And that's what he mined. Anytime he needed money, he would go out to a secret mine, and he would mine it. And that's not unusual in that country, Mike.
Did anybody else besides Clough, were they let into this secret, or was Clough the only honest man in that country?
Well, of course, there were high graders in the Lardo, but Clough wasn't one of them. And when Johnson wasn't one of them. And when Johnson died, a number of individuals in the Lardo who were privy to this, who knew Johnson had a lost cache of gold or a lost mine, looked for it, and they looked for it very assiduously. And they were dedicated prospectors. They didn't find it. There are still people looking for it today.
You can still go to that country, and how do you find out where the hotel was? I mean, is it noted, or do you have to read some archival material?
Yeah, you would have to read over some of the books on the Lardo, and it's not too tough to find where Poplar Creek was. The creek right close by. It's just to the south of town. But this isn't the only area. I mean, the Lardo itself, like all parts of the interior of British Columbia that were mining communities, declined when the ore ran out. So that all these towns of old, Mike, which would be Ferguson, which was the major town of the Lardo, has virtually vanished. There's very little left in Ferguson up on that big flat up there. But you can see the old mines close by. You can see the remains of the Nettie Allen, the Great Northern, and the Silver Cup, and the Triune, and all the rest of it.
Don't go there.
Oh, it's a fascinating area. Just a fascinating area.
But that's not where these lost mines will be. It'll be someplace else that isn't visible. Couldn't you figure that out by taking a look at old mining claims, and see country that wasn't staked?
Well, sure. We've got, I have access to most of these mining maps, but it doesn't always tell you the story. For instance, there are other lost mines and lost treasure stories in the Lardo. We know that the Chinese, for instance, mined up Cascade Creek, which isn't very far from Poplar Creek. They mined there in 1915 and did extremely well. But nobody knows exactly where they mined. And one of the other fascinating treasure stories out of the Lardo country is the Lost Silver Plate Mine. And that's on American Hill, which is the southern extension of Silver Cup Ridge. And that was laced through with very, very high-grade properties. Now, the Lost Silver Plate Mine is interesting because they found huge chunks of high-grade galena running up to 2,000 ounces a ton. And it was shot all through this ground, but they couldn't find the original vein from which it had been broken off. So it was kind of a natural phenomena, and an old guy who used to be a subscriber of mine called Joe Gallo looked for it for years and never did find it. So the Silver Plate Mine is one of the other riddles of the Lardo.
You mentioned a number of other names, too. What's this place?
The Lime Dike.
What is the Lime Dike?
Well, the Lime Dike is a peculiar geological formation of which a lot of mines came out of this particular Lime Dike. So that even up to the 7,000 and 8,000 foot level, there are mines at terrific heights in the Lardo country, and you can only work them 3 months in the year, and to get the ore out is almost impossible. To get equipment in is almost impossible. So there's some interesting prospects, some very, very high-grade prospects in this Lardo country. I find it one of the most fascinating regions of British Columbia. I mean, the scenery's the same as it was in the 1890s. When you look up at the bad shots in the Battle Range, and you look at the Uncomoplex, and the Uncomoplex River, as I mentioned before, is one of the most dangerous rivers in the province.
Where does that name come from?
It's an Indian name, Mike, and I can't give you the origin. I don't think there is a defined origin or meaning for the word that I have yet found.
Okay. How do you get to this country? What towns do you drive to get to this Lardo country?
I would drive, you can either come down from Revelstoke, but I would drive to Nelson. And then I would take that road up the west side of Kootenai Lake and up past old communities like Ainsworth and Caslow, of course, and then go on north from Caslow and go up past the head of Kootenai Lake and up past Duncan, and then shift off slightly to the northwest. And then you go past the old remains of Gold Hill, which was a kind of a satellite town of Poplar Creek. Nothing left at Gold Hill, a few broken down cabins, and that's about all. And then you go across the bridge, and you're at Poplar Creek.
Now, when all these places were in their heyday, gold was worth $16 an ounce.
Crude ounce.
Crude
$20.67 a pure ounce.
Yeah. Now, those miners may have been good. The Chinese miners may have been good. You know, they may have sniped to beat the band, but all those areas must still have vast quantities of gold that's available now to our technology, especially where the price of gold is these days. Who's staking this area now?
Quite a bit of activity. Most of the old properties are staked, but there is a flaw in the Lardo area. And the flaw is this: the gold properties generally do not tend to go to depth. Now, some of the silver properties do. You know, the Silver Cup certainly did go to depth. And to a lesser extent, Nettie L, which was a gold and silver property, went to depth. And some of the other properties, but generally speaking, those gold properties on the west side of the Lardo River did not go to any great depth. They went to a few feet. They didn't go down 1,000 feet like a lot of the mines on the Pacific Slope.
Like you said, the Markey and Gilbert maybe went down 15 feet.
Yeah, it wasn't very deep at all, Mike.
Where did these miners go to then? I mean, this is the era we're talking about, 1900, late 1800s,
yeah.
1900 and early teens. Where did they go to from there?
Well, from there they actually gravitated into the northern part of British Columbia. A lot of them did. Not all of them, of course, but many of them did. Yeah. So they went up to Alice Arm and Stewart Arm and all through that area there, you know, especially around Antioch and places like that, where there were new discoveries they hadn't been able to get into before. So the tramp miner was always that. He was a tramp miner. He went from area to area, and if another area came into prominence, he gravitated towards that area and followed the rainbow till the end of his days.
And as you pointed out, this country was so tough that it was not re-inhabited with many people. I mean,
no.
Loggers went back in there, but it wasn't a great farm country, I take it?
No. Very tough winters.
So it's very much the same now as it was in those days.
A quite memorable country, Mike.
All right. That's the Lardo. And we've been talking specifically about towns like Ferguson, towns like Poplar, and towns like Gerard.
Camborne.
Most of them disappeared now, but you still have Trout Lake City.
Trout Lake City is still there. Several hundred people in Trout Lake City, and the old Windsor Hotel, which is a classic example of an 1890s hotel, has been standing there since the 1890s, in fact.
Where are we going next time on Gold Trails and Ghost Towns?
Well, we'll probably go to Fairview, which was kind of a fascinating little gold town in the southern Okanagan in that desert country down there, and produced some magnificent mines and kind of a fascinating treasure, which we found in the late 1960s, actually 1969.
Which we found?
Yeah, a friend of mine and I, a man called Cyril Murray, we picked up about $10,000 or $12,000 worth of diamond rings and gold gold coins and so on.
So another treasure story next time on Gold Trails and Ghost Towns.
Along with the history of Fairview.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Bill Barley's our guest. He is the historian for Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. His publications in Canada West, of course, can lead us on all sorts of adventures. And next time we're going to take a look at the Ghost Town and some of the remaining workings of the area known as Fairview. Join us next time on Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. Bye-bye.